February 1944. The skies over Papua New Guinea were a graveyard for aircraft. Japanese Zeros prowled like sharks, and the jungle below swallowed planes whole, leaving no trace, no survivors, no answers. But what happened on a remote airstrip near Baba would defy every rule of aviation, every law of physics, and every understanding of what a plane could do without a living soul at the controls. It started as a routine patrol. Australian ground crews at the makeshift airfield were used to the distant rumble of engines, the flash of aluminum against the tropical sun. But this time, something was different. A B-17 flying fortress appeared on the horizon, engines sputtering, one propeller completely still. The massive bomber was losing altitude fast, heading straight for the runway. The ground crew rushed to their positions. This was clearly an emergency landing. They could see the plane's damaged state, even from a distance. Holes punched through the fuselage, one engine completely dead, smoke trailing from another. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The approach was too steep, too unstable. No experienced pilot would come in like that. And then, impossibly, the wheels touched down. The B-17 bounced once, twice, then settled onto the rough coral runway. It rolled forward, slowing gradually as if guided by an invisible hand. The ground crew sprinted toward it, expecting wounded men to stumble out, expecting chaos, expecting someone to be alive and screaming for help. But the plane just sat there, silent. The engines coughed and died one by one. The propellers spun to a stop. And still no one emerged, no hatch opened, no distress signal, just the ticking of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through bullet holes. When the crew chief finally climbed onto the wing and peered through the cockpit window, his blood ran cold. The pilot's seat was empty. The co-pilot's seat was empty. He wrenched open the hatch and climbed inside, and what he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Every single crew member was dead. Some slumped over their stations, others sprawled on the floor. Blood pooled in the radio compartment. Shell casings littered the deck. And yet somehow, impossibly, this ghost ship had flown itself home and landed as gently as if a master pilot had been at the controls. How? How does a four-engine bomber, crippled by enemy fire with no one alive to fly it, navigate miles of hostile territory and execute a perfect landing? The answer would take decades to piece together, and the truth is more remarkable than any legend. To understand the ghost landing, we need to go back 6 hours earlier, to a briefing room thick with cigarette smoke and tension. The mission was supposed to be simple, emphasis on supposed to be. Strike a Japanese supply convoy moving through the waters north of New Guinea, disrupt their logistics, get home before the Zeros showed up. Simple, routine, deadly. The B-17 in question was part of the 43rd Bomb Group, the Ken's Men, named after their commander Ken Walker, who had already been lost in combat. These crews knew the odds. Papua, New Guinea wasn't Europe. There were no neat formations of hundreds of bombers with fighter escorts. Out here you flew in small groups, often alone, over endless jungle and ocean, with Japanese fighters based on every island. The pilot was a seasoned officer, 23 years old, but with the eyes of someone much older. His co-pilot was younger, still learning, still eager. Behind them, the crew, a navigator who could find a pinprick island in 1,000 miles of ocean, a bombardier with steady hands, a flight engineer who could coax life from dying engines, radio operator, and gunners. Manning positions in the waist, tail, and top turret. They took off at dawn, the B-17 heavy with fuel and bombs. The flight out was uneventful, too uneventful. Experienced crews knew that silence was often the prelude to hell. They found the convoy right where intelligence said it would be. The bombardier lined up his sight, and the plane shuddered as the bombs fell away. Direct hits, fires erupted on the deck of a transport ship. Mission accomplished, and that's when the Zeros came. They dove out of the sun, 3 of them, maybe 4. The gunners opened fire, the plane filling with the deafening chatter of 50-caliber machine guns and the acrid smell of cordite. Tracers crisscrossed the sky. The first Zero screamed past, so close they could see the pilot's face. The top turret gunner swung around, firing, but the Zeros were too fast, too aggressive. Then the hits started coming. A line of holes stitched across the fuselage. The radio operator screamed, not in fear but in pain, clutching his chest as blood spread across his flight suit. Another burst tore through the cockpit, shattering instruments, and the co-pilot slumped forward. The pilot was hit too, a round through the shoulder, another grazing his head. Blood ran down his face, into his eyes, but he kept flying, kept the plane level. The flight engineer staggered forward from the waist, trying to help. But a third pass from the Zeros sent more rounds ripping through the bomber. He collapsed before reaching the cockpit. The navigator, the bombardier, the gunners, one by one they were hit. The tail gunner died instantly, slumped in his tiny compartment. The waist gunner tried to drag himself to a medical kit, but bled out before he reached it, and still the pilot flew. He could feel himself fading, his vision tunneling, but he had one thought: get the plane home. Get it back to base. His crew needed doctors. He needed doctors. Just hold on. Just keep the nose up. His hand slipped from the yoke, his head fell back, and the B-17 flew on. Here's where the story enters the realm of the inexplicable. With every crew member dead or dying, with the pilot unconscious or worse, the B-17 should have entered a death spiral. Planes don't fly themselves, especially not crippled bombers, with one engine out and battle damage throughout the control systems. And yet this one did. The key lies in a combination of design, luck, and the pilot's final actions. The B-17 Flying Fortress was famously stable, engineered to absorb punishment and keep flying. Its designers had built-in inherent stability. If trimmed correctly, the plane would naturally try to maintain level flight. But trimmed correctly is the operative phrase. That requires a conscious pilot making precise adjustments. In his last moments of consciousness, the pilot had done something remarkable. Even as blood loss dragged him toward oblivion, his trained instincts took over. He trimmed the plane for level flight, reduced throttle on the good engines to conserve fuel, and, most critically, set a heading. Not a random heading, but a course back toward Allied territory. Then either he passed out or died. The records are unclear, lost to time and the chaos of war. What happened next was a ghost flight that lasted hours. The B-17 droned on through the tropical sky, maintaining altitude, holding its heading with eerie precision. Below, the jungle stretched endlessly, a green hell where crashes meant no recovery, no burials, just vanishing into the canopy. But the bomber stayed aloft, its 3 working engines pulling it mile after mile toward home. Japanese fighters could have intercepted it. Thunderstorms could have torn it apart. Fuel exhaustion could have sent it plummeting. But none of these things happened. It was as if the plane itself had decided to complete the mission, to honor the dead men in its belly by bringing them home. As the B-17 crossed over Allied territory, something even stranger occurred. The plane began a gradual descent. Not a dive, not a stall, but a controlled loss of altitude, as if someone were gently pulling back on the throttles. Aviation experts would later speculate that fuel starvation in one tank might have caused an asymmetric thrust situation that paradoxically helped guide the plane downward. And then the airstrip appeared. The same strip they'd taken off from that morning. By all logic, the plane should have overflown it, or crashed miles away, or cartwheeled. Across the jungle, instead it lined up, not perfectly but close enough. The landing gear was already down, likely lowered by the pilot before he lost consciousness, in preparation for an emergency landing he'd never survived to complete. The wheels touched coral. The plane bounced, settled, rolled, the engines sputtered and died. And in the sudden silence, the ghost ship came to rest, its mission complete, its crew already gone. The Australian ground crew had seen a lot in this war. They'd scraped bodies out of wreckage, watched planes explode on takeoff, pulled burnt men from cockpits still screaming. But nothing had prepared them for this. A plane that landed itself. A crew of ghosts. The crew chief, a sergeant from Queensland with oil permanently under his fingernails, climbed into the fuselage first. The smell hit him immediately. Blood, cordite, and something else. Something sweet and terrible. He moved through the bomber, checking each station, each man. The tail gunner, sprawled in his turret, surrounded by spent brass. The waist gunners, one on top of the other. The radio operator clutching a photo of a girl back home, the navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, all gone. When he reached the cockpit, he found the pilot and co-pilot slumped in their seats. The control yoke was centered. The throttles were pulled back to idle. The trim tabs were set perfectly for level flight. And on the pilot's lap was his hand, fingers still loosely curled as if he'd just released his grip on the controls. The crew chief backed out of the plane, his face pale. He'd flown in the last war, knew planes inside and out, and what he'd just witnessed was impossible. He called for the base commander, for the intelligence officer, for anyone who could make sense of this. Within an hour, the plane was surrounded by men trying to understand how physics, aerodynamics, and fate had conspired to bring a dead crew home. The investigation began immediately. Military officials documented everything: the damage pattern, the fuel state, the control settings, the positions of the bodies. They calculated the flight time, the distance covered, the heading maintained. Every piece of data confirmed the impossible. This plane had flown itself for hours and executed a landing that most trained pilots would struggle to achieve. Theories emerged. Some said the pilot must have been barely alive, guiding the plane on instinct until the very end. But the medical examiner disagreed. The wounds were catastrophic. Death would have been rapid. Others suggested divine intervention, that God or fate had guided the bomber home. The more scientifically minded pointed to the B-17's inherent stability, to trim settings and luck and a 1,000,000-to-1 chance. But there was another detail that emerged later, one that gave the story an even more haunting dimension. Ground crew who examined the plane found the autopilot mechanism had been damaged in the attack. It wasn't functioning, so even that potential explanation that some automated system had taken over was ruled out. The plane had no autopilot, no living pilot, no explanation that satisfied the laws of aviation. Word of the ghost bombers spread through the Pacific theater like wildfire. Crews in other squadrons heard the story and didn't know whether to be comforted or terrified. Comforted that even in death, a B-17 would try to bring you home. Terrified that they might end up as another crew of ghosts, prisoners in a flying tomb. The bodies were removed with full honors. The pilot and co-pilot were buried with their hands which had guided the plane home. The crew was laid to rest together as they had flown together. And the B-17 after repairs flew again, but never with the same crew, and never without someone checking over their shoulder, wondering if they were alone in the cockpit. The story of the ghost bomber didn't end with that funeral in the jungle. It became something larger, a legend that captured the desperate, supernatural quality of the Pacific War, where men fought in some of the most remote places on Earth and witnessed things that defied explanation. In the decades after the war, the story took on different forms. Some veterans claimed to have been there, though records show many of these accounts were second-hand. The exact date became fuzzy. Some sources say February 1944, others say early 1943. The location shifted in retellings. Some placed it in New Guinea, others in the Philippines or the Solomons. Even the bomb group was debated, with different units claiming the ghost plane as their own. But the core of the story remained consistent. A B-17 shot to pieces, crew dead, landed itself. Aviation historians have spent years trying to verify every detail, and while the fog of war obscures some facts, the essential truth appears solid. Multiple witnesses, official reports that survived the war, and the inherent plausibility given the B-17's design all support that something extraordinary happened that day. What makes the story particularly poignant is what it says about the men who flew these missions. The pilot's final act in his last moments of consciousness was to give his dead and dying crew a chance. He trimmed the plane for home. He set the heading. He lowered the gear. Even as his life drained away, his training and his humanity drove him to save his brothers, or at least bring them home for burial. The B-17 itself became a symbol. Boeing's engineers had created a fortress in the sky, a plane so tough, so stable, so forgiving, that it could survive the unsurvivable. Stories of B-17s returning on one engine, with tails shot off, with entire sections blown away, became legendary. But this story, a plane that flew and landed without anyone alive to fly it, stood above them all. In modern times, aviation experts have used computer simulations to test whether the ghost landing was truly possible. The results are fascinating. With the right trim settings, adequate fuel and stable atmospheric conditions, a B-17 could theoretically maintain level flight for extended periods without pilot input. The landing, however, remains the sticking point. That requires a descent, an approach angle, gear deployment and touchdown, all of which seem to demand human control. Unless the pilot, in his final moments, had set up more than just level flight. Unless he'd begun the descent, adjusted the approach and simply ran out of time before he could complete it. In that scenario, momentum, gravity and the plane's design might have carried it the rest of the way. It's still improbable. Still extraordinary, but just barely possible. The Ghost Bomber's story endures because it touches something fundamental in us, the hope that even in our darkest moment, even in death, we might still find a way to save others, to complete the mission, to come home. For the families of that crew, there was at least the comfort of closure, of bodies returned, of knowing their sons and husbands and brothers were brought home by a plane that refused to abandon them. Somewhere in military archives, there are photos of that bomber, documents detailing the damage, maybe even the names of every crew member. But whether the story is perfectly accurate in every detail or has been embellished by time matters less than what it represents. The bond between a crew and their aircraft, the incredible engineering of the B-17, and the courage of men who flew into hell knowing they might not come back, but determined to try anyway. The Ghost Bomber of New Guinea stands as a testament to all of them, a flying tomb that became a chariot home, a machine that, for a few impossible hours, had a soul.